I want to thank you for being so punctual and being on time. If only tertiary students could take a lesson from their grandparents. Our first speaker after morning tea is Professor Tim Entwisle. Tim is not only the Director of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne, but we're honoured to have Tim as the patron of the Australian Garden History Society. He's a highly respected scientist and scientific communicator. Many of you may know Tim from his contributions to programs such as ABC Radio National's Blueprint for Living. The conference committee adopted the theme of expanding horizons for our 40th annual gathering. It was meant to reflect the leap of over 2,000 kilometres from Sydney on the east coast to the coast of New Zealand as our first offshore conference. It's also relevant to the voyage of Lieutenant James Cook, which 250 years ago this month arrived in Poverty Bay, some 500 kilometres to the north of here. In 2016, Sir David Attenborough noted that no previous expedition had brought back collections of such size and importance to a range of the natural sciences. Please welcome Tim as he takes you on a personal voyage reflecting on Banks and his work.
Thank you very much, John, and it's great to be back at the lectern. It's good we're moving through as well today. There's a nice time succession here as we move up towards the 18th century. And this is the most colourful, beautiful slide I've got in my presentation, so I might just leave it up for a few minutes so you enjoy the wonderful Banks is. I'm going to talk about Joseph Banks and his trip, of course, to Australia and to New Zealand. Some of you may have seen a presentation yesterday. I didn't get to that one, unfortunately. So if there's anything that's different between the two, yesterday's was probably correct, and mine is an interpretation of a botanist living in Melbourne. So this is the trip that Banks and Cook took, the first voyage to the Pacific of Cook. This is a German map, in fact, but you can see the places they stopped at along the way, and also, of course, that they did arrive in New Zealand before they got to Australia, and then progressed on right back to England eventually as well. So if we look at and this is something you're sort of fairly well known to most of us, I guess, through our schooling, hopefully, of this basic trip. Now, the significant dates in that trip are, first of all, leaving Plymouth, so leaving London or leaving the UK, arriving first in Tahiti and spending a couple of months there in Tahiti in 1769. And that was primarily to look at the transit or to view the transit of Venus. From there through to New Zealand, where they spent nearly 6 months here in New Zealand, quite a long time here. Then Australia, where it's a relatively short time, and much of that time, of course, repairing the ship at Endeavour River. So only a relatively short few months in Australia, where they spent time in Botany Bay from 28th of April to 6th of May. So we hear a lot about Botany Bay and Banks, and they were there for that week or so in 1770, and then back to the UK in 1771. Also quite famously, and something we're all aware of, I think, is how small that ship was, and it's this is it being repaired in Endeavour River, and a difficult trip, of course, and a difficult ship to be on, or difficult for anyone travelling at that time, and particularly for the scientists and botanists aboard, although Banks made sure he had plenty of room aboard the boat to lay out specimens, and for his rooms, and for his assistants, as we'll get to in a moment. Now, the instructions that Lieutenant James Cook had when he went off were to travel to Tahiti for astronomical observations on the transit of Venus, as I mentioned, across the sun, and they were using this at the time to calculate the distance of Earth from the sun and other celestial measurements, and I'm very keen to do that using this transit. And just as a little bit of an aside, that transit occurs in little groups of pairs, if you like, 8 years apart, every 108 or so years. So the next pair of transits, if you like, in 1874 and 1882, the Melbourne Observatory got new telescopes, new equipment, so they could observe those. So it was still something of great importance the next time it happened as well. So it's something that didn't lose its resonance a century later. The other instruction, the secret instructions they're often called, are then to sail southwards to establish the existence of a large continent which had been predicted and surveyed for rocks, plants and animals as well. So you can see it's not just about going to these lands, it is about finding out what is in those lands. And the instructions were with the consent of the natives to take possession of convenient situations or in the name of the king, or if you find the country uninhabited, then you may take possession of it. So these are the instructions that Cook had coming to New Zealand and to Australia. And he was expressly ordered not to seize land from the inhabitants. Of course, by about 1780s, when Arthur Phillip arrived, that was actually taking place and land was seized. So the value of this trip and why they were doing it, well, it was curiosity about the land and the contents and what was there, of course, to confirm what the countries and the dimensions of those lands. There were commercial and strategic advantages to travelling down into these areas and looking for plants and animals, of course, too, that they might be able to use. There was a prestige at that time in gaining new knowledge in the Age of Enlightenment. So it was about that discovery of the new, of course, as well. They were promoting and testing the pursuit of the Linnean system of naming and classification. I just give you one example there of which is a real name, I rush to assure you. This is a seaweed, an alga, a red alga, that happens to be named after a Dr. Entwisle, and it's the Entwisleia bella, the beautiful Entwisle, and so on. It's the alga that is beautiful, I rush to say. But there was a sense that they wanted to test this out. And what I mean test is that they knew, a certain number of organisms on Earth. They had names to them. What would happen if they went somewhere new? Would this system keep working? Would it be entirely broken, if you like? And then there were a couple. These are a couple of notes just at the bottom here from Attenborough. With him on the trip as a companion. And this is an important point. He took the 25-year-old Joseph Banks, who would gather natural specimens and prepare scientific notes. And so we've got a young guy, 25 years old. He employed an assistant, Daniel Solander, and 3 artists as well. So we have a very young man being sent off to, or not sent off, he wanted to go, of course. And with him, he takes Daniel Solander, who is a student of Carl Linnaeus in Sweden. So they're testing that system of Linnaeus, so it's very convenient to have one of his students there. Lived mostly in London. He's a botanist, became a librarian to Banks later in life. His trip was financed by Banks. We have Sidney Parkinson, the artist who did drawings and watercolours on the trip, of course, again financed by Banks to go on the trip. His sketches are in the Natural History Museum of London. And Joseph Banks himself, 1743 to 1820. We'll return to a little bit about Banks. This is not really a talk about Banks, it's more about his botanical legacy, but of course he had inherited wealth and estates when he began life. He was an amateur botanist at the age of 18, but he did go to university to study botany and biology, but he couldn't find a botanist at Christchurch, Oxford. So he travelled to Cambridge and got one and brought it back to Oxford. That's the way you did it in those days. And he got an astronomer and a botanist to lecture to them. But even having done that, he did not graduate from Oxford. First voyage for Banks was to Newfoundland, then Australia, and finally Iceland. So he did 3 big voyages. This is fascinating. Elected to the Royal Society at the age of 23, he was the youngest president at the age of 35, and he held that position to his death at 77. It's not. I don't think these days we'd recommend presidents stay in for that long, but it just shows the kind of prestige he had at that time. And he was an honorary director at Kew Gardens. He never was the director at Kew Gardens, but he had a lot of influence in what happened there. Joseph Banks in 1814. This is a portrait in the National Portrait Gallery of Australia where I took this photograph. And he's 70 years old in this picture. And we often see images of Banks at that age. And he's wearing a military uniform and he has the ribbon of the Order of Bath. But I do want you to think about him more like this. Now, this is the current author of this is not Banks, this is Timothy Entwisle again, at the age of 25. I just want to remind you, this is the kind of person who was heading off on the boat, not the 70-year-old Banks. So you have a 25-year-old about to go off to the other side of the earth. And so how much was known in Europe about Australia and New Zealand? Well, they knew a little bit about it. There had been voyages to the Australian area, and I hadn't quite realised there was as much contact with Australia. I knew there'd been bits and pieces, we hear about that, and I won't dwell on this, but in 1606 the first Dutch navigator reached the north end of Australia and encountered Aboriginal inhabitants there when he landed. But then following that, there were trips, including a Spanish one led by the Portuguese captain, Ferdinand de Quiros, and he actually wrote, what's interesting here, and I won't divert onto this, but he wrote to the King of Spain, who was funding that trip, and said he saw Australia, which is Austria, turned into Australia. And there's a whole story about whether they'd actually seen the continent of Australia. He was looking over that side of the ship, or he was looking the other way, in fact, and whether he did, in fact, use that name or something like it very early on. It's a very spirited debate, which I won't go into today. And yes, and so some sources say he was actually talking about Vanuatu and not the land we now call Australia. Nevertheless, interesting story if you want to check that out at some stage. But what's really interesting, between 1606 and 1770, there are 52 European ships that made contact with Australia. So the 52 ships have made some contact with Australia. And 41 of those from the Netherlands, of course, and including Abel Tasman, and a lot of these are for trading missions through down into the south. So there was a little bit known in Europe, but not very much. So the way I would see it is Banks, this is something that happened 50 years ago. Banks, the 25-year-old, probably felt like he was going to the moon. That was probably for him. He was going to a place when people hadn't been before, they knew very little about it, and he was going to see a landscape that was entirely new. He would touch it for the first time. Again, as a 25-year-old, it's interesting to read his diaries, and his diaries are now all online. So the State Library of New South Wales has a wonderful site devoted to Joseph Banks and his writings and publications, and you can read some of these. And you need to read these as a 25-year-old going to the moon, if you like, or going somewhere like the moon. And on one page he says, "We wish our friends in England could be at the assistance of some magical spying glass," which I guess would be the internet today, "and peep at our situation." So Solander sits in the cabin just opposite me, journalising. Between them, a large bunch of seaweed. I don't think it would be Entwisle, but nevertheless, a lovely seaweed upon the table, wood and barnacles, and they'd see that notwithstanding our different occupations, our lips move very often, and it goes on about just how exciting it is, talking about the land they would see very, very soon. So he's an excited 25-year-old as they get down towards the south. When he wrote this, it was clear that they're getting near to New Zealand. So this is the 3rd of October, 250 years ago. So the first observations, they see New Zealand. Banks thinks it may be part of the southern continent. Cook says, no, it's not. You're wrong on that, Banks. But nevertheless, he gets excited. And then in January, Cook climbs up to the peak to see what becomes Cook Strait and the separation of the two islands. And he realises, of course, and demonstrates to himself, these are not part of that larger southern continent that they sought. From there, they go further south, and they do see Stewart Island, but for strategic reasons apparently. I'm not quite sure the backstory to this. Others here might know more about this, but they don't talk about the Strait being there, and they hide that from their early maps. So they're spending time in New Zealand. They're mapping the islands and finding out much more about not only the islands but the people living there. Now, the first contact, which is being talked about a lot in New Zealand, where I think 9 Maori were killed. Banks says, thus ended the most disagreeable day my life has yet seen. Black be the mark for it, and heaven sent that may never return to embitter future reflection. So it had an impact on him as a 25-year-old as well. In the Encyclopedia of New Zealand, it's described later as saying after this they had friendly contact with Maori, but it was obviously a difficult first contact in New Zealand. Now, the observations of the Flora, which is what I'm really focusing on today, are generally fairly cursory, but in the diary you get various statements about it: abundant grass and trees, and it says the greatest part of which will recompense us for the want of variety. That's the first comment of Banks, when he probably doesn't quite understand what he's got in front of him. But the writings are not that interesting as anyone interested in plants and vegetation. Banks particularly, the finest timber my eyes ever beheld. That's the kind of description you get. There's timber, there's wood there, they're fantastic. That's nice, Banks, but tell us a little bit more about the detail, if you could, please. And he notes you do get a little bit more, in fact, about people and about cultural use of plants, and fern roots being treated there for starch, and yams we've been hearing about this morning, sweet potatoes grown commonly. And one area, though, he makes an interesting comment: such places we're not seen, to the least appearance of cultivation. I suppose they live entirely on fish, dogs and enemies. Now, I think there's meant to be a comma between fish, dogs. I don't think fish dog is a thing, but and enemies, I think, is an allusion to cannibalism, which they had seen or heard about on their trip. So this is his comment. Again, the perspective of a young man sort of trying to make sense of what's going on. Also being a little bit, I suppose, his humour, or his black humour, does come through in his diaries a little bit. There are comments all through. And Solander and myself are now exhausted all the plants at Queen Charlotte Sound, and they went and searched for mosses and small things with great success. So even when they'd seen all the plants, they went off and saw other things. But again, you don't get much description of what they look like in those diaries. So they leave New Zealand, they set course for Australia, they get there. There you go. Oh no, it's up there. Sorry, it just disappeared on my screen, which is why something went blank. I'll look up there. So on the diary, we set aside most or not all the arguments and proofs that have been advanced to prove there must be a southern land. And so they do decide that they don't know what lies southward, and the ship's not prepared for such a journey. So they're not going to go further south, and instead they go across via Van Diemen's Land and the east coast of New Holland. So they're the terminology being used for the land. So they knew it was there, well, they weren't quite sure of the shape of it, and they would head that way rather than the southern land or the Antarctic kind of continent that they were originally thinking they might be able to see. Now, the first observations of New South Wales, part of New Holland, we get a large float of seaweed, a small butterfly and a small land bird. And that indicates, of course, they're coming near land. It sounds a bit like the Ark, doesn't it? A kind of biblical reference. Sloping hills, trees and shrubs, as he writes, interspersed with large tracts of sand. Again, this is the kind of description you get. It's not particularly helpful in describing the land. When we come back and we're trying to understand what it looked like at that time, it doesn't help a great deal. This is an interesting one, smokes and fires, and we suppose the gentlemen ashore had a plentiful breakfast to prepare at 10 o'clock in the morning. So this is a lovely comment, I think, that they're having their breakfast on the land. It's 10 a.m. in the morning. They must be sitting back with eggs and bacon, I expect he thought they would be having. And the first contact in Australia is different to New Zealand in some ways, but this is from a Menzies lecture given by a colleague, Steve Hopper, a few years ago, and he described it as the visit, essentially being told to bugger off when they arrived at Botany Bay. That was the the two Aboriginal men who met them on the shore. And one of the views was that there was a large white bird filled with possums scampering up and down. That's one of the versions of the story from local Aboriginal people about that ship arriving. And Australians were more used to visitors messaging first. So there'd be fire or the message stick. So they're very surprised at somebody just coming in from the land. And of course, they're wearing those weird clothes and all that kind of thing. And they did shoot. First of all, they sent a volley above their head, then they shot into the leg of the older man. There was an older and younger man. The older one eventually ran back and got a shield and then came back. They shot at them again, and then they realised quite sensibly to retract back to the hills, and Cook and his team landed on land. So they did have observations of the Indigenous people. As I said, Banks wrote more about people sometimes than he did about other things, and he summarised his view again as a 25-year-old Englishman. In Tahiti, he was greeted cautiously, New Zealand belligerently, according to Banks, and in Australia with aloofness. That was his description of what they got. And he describes later, it's interesting, he says there's a kind of apathy he thought in Australians, and for him, his judgment of that was this was worse than the violence, or as he said, the thieving of the Tahitians. And he's particularly vexed, he said, which is interesting, their proximity to the thriving plant life. He's thinking, such a wonderful plant life in Australia, why do the local people seem so, as he said, apathetic? It's a very odd kind of, he's trying to make sense, I guess, of reaching that new country, the new people, the new flora, and I don't know if he expected them to all out there with their herbarium collecting them or with microscopes or something. He just didn't see them doing the things he expected. So his observations and Cook's observations of the Indigenous flora, woods, lawns and marshes by Cook. Cook was actually a little bit better than Banks, but Banks you get vast quantities of grass. Wood is here, a little variety. Largest trees are larger than our oaks in England, so at least Cook's making an effort here to describe the vegetation. And again, Cook talks about pine-like trees, the casuarinas, palms perhaps, which could be cycads as well, and mangroves around the head of the harbour. So we get a taste of what they're seeing. And then they botanised, and in the diaries we get various views of what they're seeing. So plants that they hadn't seen before, but some that they'd seen from West Indian plants the last time, so some similarities. Lots of fruits and things they hadn't seen before, particularly in the tropics when they were in Endeavour River. And Solander and myself employed winding up our botanical bottoms. I don't know what a botanical bottom is. And I looked it up on the internet, and I wouldn't suggest you do that. So he was examining what he wanted, making a complement of specimens of as many species as they possibly could. And they were botanising. Sometimes they'd run out of things to do. And then at one point he says the plants were entirely complete and there was nothing new to be found. Well, they didn't find the whole flora of Australia, but nevertheless they felt they'd done pretty well. And they described the indigenous fauna. So this was their second lieutenant was shooting. He had the good fortune to kill an animal that had so long been the subject of their speculations. Forelegs extremely short, no use to it in walking. Its hind disproportionately long. It hops 7 or 8 feet. You sort of perhaps can guess what this animal is going to be. And they killed it, and today they dressed it for our dinners and provided excellent meat. So that the first one they encountered they ate, of course, and they did enjoy eating it. But the other little observation I'd make about the kangaroo is Samuel Johnson, who I think at the last meeting of Australian Garden History Society I mentioned in passing. And when the stories got back to the UK, he rose from his seat one day and did an imitation. He stood erect, put his hand out like feelers and jumped around. And that was the most amusing thing going on in London at the time. Just getting Samuel Johnson to appear like a kangaroo was pretty exciting. So the stories he came back with really gave him a lot of cachet when he got back to London. But the botanical bounty of the Endeavour, look, it includes a stack of specimens, 30,000 plant specimens, a huge number, pressed in book proofs. Interesting, Milton's Paradise Lost was one of the book proofs they used. And just to compare that to the Malaspina expedition, which was a little later and went to South America, and they did drop in on Port Jackson actually on that trip, but they brought back 15,000 specimens from 5 years. Slightly more species involved, but the Cook's voyage had 30,000. They did that because they did lots of duplicates or replicates. So they would collect lots of the same thing, which is why there are collections around the world and why we know it so well. 3,000 or so plant species from the entire trip, 900 from Australia, 130 from Botany Bay. Illustrations mostly by Sydney Parkinson, but also a couple of others. And these were not published until very, very recently, as probably many of you know, in the Banks Florilegium. There were new plants from many new places, and I'm not going to run through, of course, all the plants they collected, but they were from all the places on their voyage, of course, and the first one from Madeira. So once they get out of Europe, there's here Heberdenia excelsa, a small tree from wet forests they collected from there, Anotophagus, a beech from Terra del Fuego in 1769. These are just a couple of examples of things they collected. The breadfruit they got from Society Islands, 1769. Phormium tenax, of course, flax from New Zealand. They collected in October while they were here, and here's a herbarium specimen of that, which you would recognise all around the place here when you're travelling. You'll see that in about that, at the moment, the fruits have dropped off, I think. You're seeing the sort of stalks of the inflorescence. And then when they get to Australia, lots of collections, and probably most famously Banksia serrata, Old Man Banksia from Botany Bay in April 1770. And here are two specimens, one from Melbourne, one from New South Wales. As I said, they got replicates. They sent them all back to London. And these beautiful specimens here, just look at the detail in these. And these were collected 250 years ago, still used botanically, still scientifically important, still with the same hairs on the leaves. You can still see the detail of those flowers. And these are just amazing collections representing that period. As I said, many copies of all those collections, and in the early part of the 20th century, those were distributed around the world, so replicates were sent to herbaria all around the world. It wasn't really repatriation. I think there was a little bit of that in it, but it was also mitigation of risk. So, and as an example, the Natural History Museum of London did catch fire during World War II, and that damaged some of the specimens in that collection. So it was quite fortuitous that these collections were distributed, and I just put a picture there of a fire that happened last year at Rio de Janeiro Museum. It still happens today. That's why we have lots of replicates, and we distribute material all around the world, not only of dried material but also of living material and seeds as well. And I won't run through these, but the specimens now end up in all kinds of places, so 800 still in London, plus many more actually. That's just the types or the important ones. New South Wales has many here, in New Zealand, of course, many, and I've got Christchurch listed there, Auckland. Victoria, we have 359 at my herbarium, and then many, many more. And this is not really comprehensive. We're not quite sure how many specimens there are, but many herbaria hold records of these, which is very important, not only for that risk mitigation, but for the stories they tell, which I'll come to a little shortly. So what else did Banks bring back to London? He brought back news of surfing. He discovered that, or didn't discover that, of course, we shouldn't use that word. He noted that, and he saw their chief amusement was taking out these old canoes and bringing them back. This is in Tahiti. The second one, though, is a tattoo, which he may or may not have brought back to London. So he saw somebody being tattooed, and he thought it looked a little bit painful. So he may not have got a tattoo, but there are stories circulating that he did get a tattoo to take back to London. I'm sure he didn't, because if he did, he would have written about it. He's that kind of person. He would not have had a tattoo and not told somebody about it. So what did they do next? Well, Parkinson unfortunately died on the trip between Java and Cape Town, so he didn't return to London. Solander botanised when he got back, and he was the keeper of natural history of the British Museum, and he lived with Banks, and he died in 1782. Banks, well, one thing Banks didn't do was publish the botanical discoveries he made from Australia and New Zealand. One of the things we sometimes think of Banks as a great botanist, which he's interesting. He's a botanical bureaucrat. He supported lots of trips, he funded trips, and even after this trip he encouraged the settlement of Australia, the penal colony. But it wasn't really a botanist. And again, I don't go into all the detail of this, but he authored perhaps 3 botanical names in his whole life. So he never wrote up any of that material he brought back from Australia or New Zealand. He collected the specimens, which is actually very, very important, so I'm not dismissing that, but he did not describe them. And even when you look up these names he authored, we suspect Solander did that and just put his name on them anyway. Banks really didn't have... He did that little bit of training, but he didn't really follow up in doing any botanical work, which is fine, but he wouldn't hold down a job in a university these days. That's the only thing I would comment on, because he had a publication record of 0. But they collected, 1,400 species new to science on that expedition. So they made a huge contribution, but not through describing species. And the other thing he didn't do was come back to Australia. And I'll just quickly jump to Samuel Johnson, because this is as a comparison. Samuel Johnson, when he excused himself, if I use that term, from going on Cook's second voyage, I say excused himself because he was asked, would you like to go on this trip? Would you be interested in going on this trip? Just as a hypothetical question. And he said, so Boswell says, have you some desire to go on this expedition? And Johnson says, well, yes, I did think about it, but I laid it aside, sir. It's always put that way. There's very little of intellectual in the course, but besides, I see at a small distance. He can't see very far. He's got very poor eyesight. So it's not worth going there to see birds fly, which he wouldn't have seen fly, or fishes swim, that he would not have seen swim. So he felt his eyesight was too bad to go. That's a polite way of declining the trip. Banks, on the other hand, Banks declined to go on the second trip. They tried to fix the boat up so he gave instructions on what he'd like the boat to look like, and it had this great artifice on it, and built his cabins, and they tried it out and went out into the harbour, and it basically would have sunk. It was just so topsy-turvy it would not have been able to get down to the Pacific. And so they had to take off all these extra space or extra rooms that Banks wanted on. And this is his comment. He swore and stamped on the wharf like a madman. He instantly ordered his servants and all things out of the ship and said he was not going to go back to Australia again. He wouldn't go on the voyage, and he wouldn't unless he could ride the waves triumphantly at the pomp and splendour of an Eastern monarch. That's not his description of himself, I rush to say. But then reading other descriptions later writers use terms such as big-headed botanist, absurdly swollen head, juvenile, self-important. So the great Joseph Banks was not always well loved. He did go on another expedition. He went to Iceland, he married, he lived on his estate, he became baronet in 1781. He advised King George III on Royal Botanic Gardens cure, as I've mentioned. He did fund and encourage many other voyages, and he got awards as well. So look, and this is a cartoon, in fact, from the Australian Cartoons, an exhibition called Inked, that's at the National Library of Australia. And this is, what's it say, the great South Sea caterpillar transformed into a Bath butterfly. His legacies, well, botanical infrastructure. As I say, he really did sort of not so much begin botany, but he really encouraged the study of plants. And at that time, there's a fascinating time in England where really botany wasn't such a big thing, and it wasn't being taught, as I mentioned already, that well. Very few chairs of botany in the universities, and compared to mainland Europe, there really wasn't a lot of botany going on. They're more like enlightened gardeners, is the description of the Brits at that time. The Banks and Solander collection, those specimens, that treasure is really, really important, and set the foundation for the documentation of the flora of New Zealand, the flora of Australia. And I just put this diagram up. This is currently what we know about Australia and New Zealand, a pie chart. And the black bits in the middle are what we know, and the coloured bits are not. And you can see vascular plants down on one far left there. We know 90% of them, we think. Some of the other groups far less. So all this knowledge, though, and a lot of that scientific exploration of these countries in terms of understanding from a scientific point of view began with that trip and that material from that trip. So there's an incredibly important legacy there. Then there were food, fibre, medicine, first fleet plants, and a lot of that economic trade as well. It was incredibly important for that trip. One thing that didn't happen, I think, is to come, and we alluded to this, I suppose, in my opening remarks today, but reconciling the knowledge of Australia's First Peoples and New Zealand's with Western science and benefiting the study of our country's flora and its true history. And I'll just add a picture of gardening in Australia. I mentioned there was no ornamental gardening in Australia. I think it sounds like it's the same in New Zealand in the sense of, planting for flowers and display. But of course there was agriculture going on, as has been demonstrated by Bruce Pascoe quite recently. Now to finish, I just want to show you the cabinet. So I called my talk the Joseph Banks Cabinet, and you can worry about the apostrophes later as to where they go, because I spent ages trying to work out whether or not to put them in. I decided to put none in the end. This is the Director's office in Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney. My wife Linda on the right with her brother John, looking at the Sir Joseph Banks cabinet, and in that cabinet you can see a specimen of Banksia aurata collected from Botany Bay in April 1770. And this is just the most amazing thing to show to people, to demonstrate not only the history of that botanic garden, but the history of exploration and discovery of plants in Australia. And that cabinet, when it was put on display in the Red Cedar in Australia Museum of Sydney exposition, had a little label that said this, the Sir Joseph Banks cabinet, without apostrophes, a natural history cabinet made of Australian woods, including red cedar, and donated, and there's a bit of a history there, to the British Museum, and it came via sort of Banks offices to the British Museum and then through to Australia, and it's in the director's, or has been the director's office of the gardens. It was interesting, some of those cabinets, there are more of them, went up for auction a little after that, and there's a little bit about how much they're worth there, and they were put up as made of Australian red cedar, of course. They're in the Red Cedar of Australia exhibition. My little footnote at the very bottom is it turned out to be mahogany, not red cedar. And my last slide, though, is of something far more authentic than that cabinet and the wood it was made of. The cabinet's authentic, just the wood was a little bit suspect. And I will finish with this slide, just to return to the Banksia, because I think that authentic legacy we have and the value of that specimen, not only for science and the history of science, the history of, I suppose, of what's gone on in Australia particularly, and also New Zealand over the last few hundred years, but this is the kind of thing in botanic gardens we show to people, and they realise the importance of what a botanic garden is, they realise the importance of what botany is, they realise the importance of our naming systems, why we do all this, and this has helped us fund and look after botanic gardens through the years. So I think this specimen itself tells much of the story. Thank you.
We have time for one question, if there's one questioner. I'm going to ask a question then. Tim, did an accurate chronometer, was it around when Cook sailed, and was he able to estimate longitude?
This is my blank look. Someone in the audience is going to know the answer to this. I don't know.
I think so. He took the chronometer as a trial, trying it out.
That's right, I have read that, yes. On the second voyage, but not the first? Ah, that's where okay, good. So no chronometer on the first, one on the second, yes? You've got more to add to that as well?
Oh, not really, it's just that with Botany Bay, Banks, there's much talk, and you mentioned it again this morning, about wonderful trees at Botany Bay, but I don't believe there are ever any wonderful trees around Botany Bay.
Well, I think there would have been casuarinas, and there were little short, stumpy eucalypts. When you say wonderful trees... No, it's, I think if you're looking for the big, tall... Yes, I think when you think of the big, tall tropical forests they'd been through, and then they come to little stunted stuff at Botany Bay, that was a come-down for sure.
A case of beauty in the eye of the beholder.
For a botanist, though, wonderful.
Tim, thank you so much for a very interesting voyage through history.